We have been waiting for Dr. Moore to give us a presentation. The Academy feels very privileged that she would come to Yachats and speak to our group, speak to our town, our audience. Dr. Moore is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, Oregon State University. She's written many books, some of which are on the table. She will be more than happy to sign them for you if you purchase them. So, her topic, global warming between hell and high water, was a little controversial for some of the papers, but they printed it anyway, and I appreciate that. So I don't want to take any more of your time. I want Dr. Moore to have all the time that she needs. So please stand up with me, give Dr. Moore a Yachats standing ovation.
Yachats is the coolest place I know. And of course, I would come to speak to the Yachats Academy of Arts and Sciences. This is very, very cool. It's quite an honor, and I am so glad to be here, and the people that I meet are so interesting. It's just wonderful. But I'm feeling a little bit uneasy because I have actually left my academic position. And I don't plan an academic talk or a philosophical discourse. What I plan really is a cry from the heart. Why did I leave academics? I left academics because the university is too slow. We don't have time for the pace of a university. University is in many ways a machine for delaying action. And we have to, well, that was a very little You guys are funny. Yeah, and so we really right now have to stop the fossil fuel machine, and there's not time to get it through a curriculum. We live in a hinge decade. You could drive a nail right through the middle of this decade, and the whole history of humankind would balance on that point. We don't know which way it's going to tilt. But we're the ones who are going to determine this decade, the story of how that history unfolds. We're the ones who are going to write that. And I don't know what that story is. It could be a crime novel. It could be a horror story or a story of apocalypse. It could be a thriller, for sure. But I want to help write the story of this decade as a love story. It has to be that way. I want to talk about the love that we have for justice, the love we have for the children, and the love we have for the earth, and the kinds of obligations that that imposes on us, our love for our beloved, beloved places. So what's the setting for this story? Honestly, it changes all the time. And I could go into a lot of facts about the rising sea levels and about the northward spreading diseases and about the amplitude of the waves. But you would tell me stop, wouldn't you? You would say stop, stop, stop. We know that. We're going to come out here for you to just stand here and depress us. But you know, and it keeps coming in. I'm sorry. I can't keep up with this news either. From the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, the Northwest is at risk for more wildflower. With that all in favor, say aye. Unfortunately, what we are at risk for is wildfires, earlier snowmelt eroding coasts, and that's from this Oregon state, and that the coast is particularly expected to change dramatically as the sea level rises at least 2 feet by the end of the century. Other findings, stream levels will go down because of an earlier snowmelt and the wildfire risk increases. The report suggests that the local climate will rise by up to 14 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And the only way to avert that risk is drastic change. Okay. So now we know that. So I only want to tell you two additional things, two facts that have really stunned me. And the first is that our atmosphere every single day is collecting heat energy that's the equivalent to 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs. 400,000 atomic bombs every day, 365 days a year, today, tomorrow, and the next day. And that the result, according to a study by 500 scientists led by a team from Stanford, is that unless we take immediate and concrete action, by the time today's children have grown to middle age, the life support systems of the earth will be irretrievably damaged. Who are these children? I know one of them. Her name is Zoe, and she is my granddaughter. In the evening, she lies in bed with the nightlight on because she's a little bit afraid of the dark. Not a whole lot afraid, but a little bit afraid of the dark. And she giggles and she sings herself to sleep. And what she sings as she goes to sleep is kookaburra, laugh, gayer life must be. When she's middle-aged, the Earth's life support systems will be irretrievably damaged. Water to drink, fresh air to breathe, food systems to sustain her. Hey, I hear that child giggling in the dark, and I say to myself, that's it. It's over. I'm not going to do anything in my life but try to make the world safe for the laughter of little children who are afraid of the dark. That's it. The first thing that's really important to say is that we can do this. We can keep the temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius or lower. We can do it if we start today. So I'm quoting James Hansen here, who is a NASA scientist. He ran the numbers. If we start this year, 2013, and if we achieve a 6% global reduction, 6% global reduction in carbon emissions this year and every subsequent year, and if we begin a massive global reforestation effort and soil sequestration campaign, we can keep the temperature to that presumably livable rise. If we wait until 2020, it's 15% a year, and if we wait until 2030, it's too late. So that's our work. Here, we know what we have to do. But the question that I ask is, why do we have to do it? I mean, what is it? What is it that makes this so urgent, and what is it that makes this so compelling? So I thought, let me just talk a little bit about some of the reasons why action is not an option. It is absolutely a moral requirement. Here's what I believe. That although climate change is definitely an economic issue, and it's definitely a political issue, and it's a scientific and technological issue, it's fundamentally a moral issue, and it calls for a moral response. And I would say, and forgive the bluntness, but I would say that it's not only monumentally stupid, but it's wrong to wreck the world. And that to take what we need for our profligate lives and leave a ransacked and dangerously unstable world for our children, that's not worthy of our love for the kids. And to let it slip away, the seaweed in the coast, the fish in the seas, the stripes on a lily, the firs in the forest, to let it slip away because we're too busy or we don't care enough or because we have to get the kids to soccer practice, that's a betrayal of our love for the earth. And I also would say that when fossil fuel companies, to make astounding and unimaginable profits, show themselves willing to take down the global systems that sustain lives on Earth, I would say that that's moral monstrosity on a cosmic scale. But you know what? I'm a philosopher, and we're not supposed to call people names. We're supposed to do reasoning about ethics. And so that's I think what we really ought to do. That's the last name I'll call. I think so. What we want is a reasoned public discourse. And what I would call for is a national discourse about what are our deepest values, what are our deepest beliefs about what is right and good and true and worthy of us. And check those against our experience of how we live in a world that's threatened by climate change. So the point I would make is that scientists have reached an overwhelming consensus on the facts of the climate change, and they back it up with evidence. But what we need is a corresponding consensus about the moral urgency of climate change action, and back that up with our best kind of moral reasoning. forgive me, this is what you get from a philosophy professor. You get a syllogism, and here it comes. This is a practical syllogism, and it's Aristotle who gave this beautiful thing to us. Any argument that reaches a conclusion about what we ought to do is going to have two premises. The first premise is a factual premise that's based on evidence. It's scientific. This is the way the world is. This is the way the world will be if we continue in this way. But from facts alone, you can't make an inference about what you ought to do. For that, you need a normative principle. You need an affirmation of what you value. You need some sort of national or community consensus about the way the world ought to be, about the way you want your community to be. If you know the way the world is, and you know the way you think it ought to be, then you can come to some conclusion about what you ought to do. So what I'm calling for is this consensus, is this conversation about the second premise. And where is it that we come together and affirm our deepest values? In our churches, in our families, in community gatherings, in literature, in art, in universities, in public meetings, all these ways that we have of talking about what we really care about. So my colleague Michael Nelson and I decided that we were going to try to jumpstart this conversation about our deepest values. And so we set up a project where we wrote to 100 of the world's moral leaders. And we asked them to respond to us in 2,000 words or less, because some global moral leaders can be kind of long-winded. We asked them to respond to us with an answer to this question: do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities as our own? Do we have a moral obligation to the future? The answers came back in beautiful, beautiful essays, and we put them together in this book. They categorize themselves into 14 different kinds of reasons. This is not a search for the single reason. This is a search for this great plurality of reasons, so that no matter what worldview you bring to the conversation, you will find something that speaks to you of your obligation to the future. Do we have an obligation to the future? Yes, for the survival of humankind. Yes, for the sake of the children. Yes, for the sake of justice. Yes, to prevent the greatest violation of human rights the world has ever seen. Yes, because compassion requires it. Yes, because we love the world. Yes, for the sake of all life on the planet. Yes, for the stewardship of God's creation. And more. But for tonight I chose only 3, and I chose them because they speak most strongly to me, and because I wonder if they also wouldn't speak as strongly to you. So I want to talk about 3 reasons why we have an obligation to the future, 3 moral reasons, in the hopes that they would remind you why you get up every single day, I know you do, with a to-do list of things you're going to do to make the world a better place, and also to give you reasons why you might have, what you might offer to other people who wonder what their obligations are. So, why do we have to stop climate change? I think the first reason is because we love justice. We care about justice. And that climate change is a violation of justice if it is anything at all. On the one hand, it's not the problem. It's not that people are going to suffer, although they will. The problem is that people are going to suffer unjustly. And that some people are going to enjoy the presumed advantages of the reckless use of fossil fuel. But the ones who are going to absorb the consequences are not the people who are absorbing the benefits. They are the powerless and voiceless all around the world. Who are these voiceless beings who are absorbing the costs of climate change and not reaping any of the benefits? Who are the ones who can't speak in their own defense? Well, first of all, plants and animals, taking a terrible hit. Future generations. There's nobody here from a future generation to speak to us tonight. Marginalized people, both literally and figuratively, people on the margins of the economy, people on the margins of the continents, and the children. So, you have among you, I hope you know, a person who's working very hard on climate change as a violation of human rights, and working very hard to help people use the various declarations of human rights to call attention to the immorality of climate change. That would be Tom Kearns. I hope you sign him up to speak to you. He's doing really important global work. Let me just read you a little bit about justice and human rights from a contributor to our book whose name is Sheila Watt-Cloutier. You know Sheila Watt-Cloutier? She's the former head of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So she's up there by the North Pole. And among the harms, she says, that we have suffered in Canada and Alaska are the eroded landscape, the contaminated drinking water, the coastal losses because of erosion, longer sea ice-free seasons and the melting permafrost. And it's becoming very stark. And it's becoming a really dangerous reality for many of us up here. And so it's starting to undermine the ecosystem, the very land, ice, and snow that we depend on for our own physical and cultural survival. What we are doing here is that we are defending our right to culture, our right to lands traditionally used and occupied, our right to health, our right to physical security, our right to our own means of subsistence, and our rights to residence and movement. And because our culture is based on the cold, the ice and the snow, we are in essence defending our right to ice. Reason number 2, because we love the children. So let's talk about the children. We know they didn't make this mess. We know they don't deserve what is coming at them like a freight train. Nonetheless, they're going to be living in whatever is left of the world after we get done with it. And unless we stop fossil fuels, we know perfectly well that they'll have to live as well as they can in a world of violent weather and northerly spreading disease and water shortage, collapsed fishery systems, people, collapsed agricultural systems, wars for resources, and massive movements of people driven from their homes by flood or wildfire or the failure of their crops. It's a betrayal of the children. My friend, the poet, Brian Doyle, I said to him, Brian, tell me, in your own beautiful way, why do we have to stop climate change? Here's what he said. Because we swore and vowed to every god we ever imagined or invented or dimly sensed that we would care for our children with every iota of our energy when they came to us miraculously from the sea of the stars. Because they are the very definition of innocent, and every single blow and shout and shiver of fear that rains down upon them is utterly undeserved and unfair and unwarranted. Because we used to be them, and we remember dimly what it was like to be small and frightened and confused. And I would add, because we promised them. We held those little babies in our arms and we promised them the world. So here's what obsesses me. I'm sorry, pretty soon I'll tell a joke. But here's what obsesses me. And I confess I am speaking from obsession. I cannot get this out of my mind. What will we tell them? What will we tell these children when we're old? And they come to us with their babies in their arms. And they ask us, what did we do in that hinge decade? What were we thinking? What did we do to protect the world for them? And I honestly think that before we can bring our voices to answer them, they'll interrupt us. Don't tell me you didn't know. You knew. Don't tell me you thought there was time. You knew there wasn't. Don't tell me you didn't know what to do. Anything would have been better than nothing. And don't tell me that the forces against you were too great. Nothing is greater than the forces against us now. So here's Severin Suzuki, who was a child when she made this speech in front of the world at their convention, at a climate change convention. Severin Suzuki is the daughter of David Suzuki. You may have heard of his work in Canada. At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our messes, not to hurt other creatures. You teach us to share and not be greedy. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? We are your own children. You are deciding what kind of world we're growing up in. Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying, everything's going to be all right. It's not the end of the world. But I don't think you can say that anymore. My dad always says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. Reason number 3. Because we love the earth. I don't know if you, like I, were raised in a church where we sang, for the beauty of the earth. Did you? This our hymn of grateful praise. Yeah. Well, I came to the coast today. You were here all day, right? You know what you have. Oh my God. I saw a seagull. Audubon tells me not to call them seagulls, that there's no such thing as a seagull. There's like a California gull, there's a clarion gull. I saw a gull that had something like a clam in his mouth flying away, and another gull came and grabbed it by the tail and stalled it. And there were 2 gulls stalled in the air. Just going like this, like, oh man, we really screwed. And then finally, one of them let go and they could fly away. It was just great. It's so great what we have here. Now, I don't know if you believe that this world was created by God, or whether you think it's the result of the creative urgency of the universe. I don't know what you think. It doesn't really matter. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you think it is God who made this world. Well, don't think for a minute that God is indifferent. This is the God who took time at the end of every day to look over his creation and say, and it was good. It's good. I don't know. This is a philosophical problem, so please identify yourselves, philosophers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa! There's more philosophers in this room than there are on the Oregon State University campus. That's cool. I told you this is an interesting place. Okay, here's what I want to know, philosophers. Can an omniscient and omnipotent God feel grief? I don't know the answer to that. I really don't know the answer, but I can imagine a God pressing his fist to his mouth in sorrow and rage to keep himself from crying out in the night. Can you imagine that? Sometimes in the storms, it's even possible that we hear God crying for his creation. I just don't know. I don't know how to hear. I don't know how to listen. But let's say that you don't believe it was God who created the world. Let's say you believe that this is the flowering, the blooming, that this whole world is the blooming, the lyrical blooming of all of creation. Even so, when you look at this world, you can see that it is irreplaceable. It's essential. It's beautiful. It's fearsome. It's beyond human understanding. Stop me if you disagree. And that is the language of the sacred. Either way, either set of beliefs, the reckless destruction of the world is a failure of reverence. The world calls to us for gratitude and reverence. Climate change is that love betrayed. It's the failure to honor and protect all those little lives in the forest and at the edge of the sea. It really matters. So we know what we have to do, and we know why we have to do it. Let me turn now to this question. What is blocking us from taking action? Why are we sitting here? What is blocking us from taking action? With all these overwhelming reasons to act, all these loyalties put to the test, all these reasons that are based on our deepest and most fiercely held values, why is it hard for us to act? I have 3 ideas. 3 things that I think are not true, but which we hold in our minds and that keep us from going forward. One of them, I think, is this notion that we have met the enemy and it is us. You've heard this, right? People say, oh, you can't complain about the fossil fuel industry because, if you really want to know who's responsible, it's you. Well, I want to be careful about this because this is tricky. You all know what externalization is, right? The economic term externalization. This notion that a profit-seeking corporation will try to keep the profits for itself, and it will try to externalize or foist off the cost of doing business onto the commons. Okay, that's the externalization. For example, it's expensive to scrub contaminants from coal smoke. And it's very cheap to filter dirty air through children's lungs. So if you want to be a profit-making company, you will try to externalize the costs of cleaning that air. Or it's very expensive to safely contain and store toxic contaminants. And it's far cheaper to store toxins in women's breasts and the brains of their children. So you see what I mean about what externalization is. I think that what we're seeing right now is the externalization of shame, where the corporations who are, I think, responsible for this carbon pollution are externalizing the blame onto us. And I think it must be one of the biggest triumphs of big oil to make us blame ourselves for climate change, even while the corporations are spending billions of dollars to transform us into mindless consumers of self-destructive products, including gasoline. To make us blame ourselves, even while they're leveraging their influence. I wrote down bribes, but I'm trying to be nice. I said I would be. Even as they leverage their influence in Congress to make sure that we don't have alternative ways to heat our homes. And we don't have alternative ways to travel to our jobs. So when I hear people say, we bet the enemy and it is us, I respectfully and philosophically say, that's bullshit. Of course. Was it the word hell that the newspaper objected to? Of course, we should spend and invest and work and travel more thoughtfully. Absolutely, we should dramatically cut our use of fossil fuels. That said, I'm not the one who cut corners and caused an oil gush in the Gulf of Mexico. And I'm not the one who's doing my best to undermine the agencies that might control fracking. And I'm not lobbying Congress to open oil drilling in the Arctic. And I'm not cutting funding for alternative energies. And I'm not sitting around a boardroom table plotting how to use every loophole and law and lawyer and lie to run over the people who are trying to protect their homes from fracking, for example, or coal trains. The big oil companies will tell you they're just responding to public demand. But it's very clear they're not responding to public demand as much as they are trying very hard to manipulate it. Building infrastructures that force us to use fossil fuels, increasing the demand for energy-intensive products through advertisement, and creating confusion about the harmful effects of burning fossil fuels. So we have met the enemy, and it is true that I'm going to try to do everything in my power to make sure it isn't me. But I'm not going to let big oil externalize its moral shame on me for its attack on the earth. Let's get over that. And let's get over this too. Let's get over this view that adaptation is the answer. It is not. Rex Tillerson, who is the CEO and chair of the board and the president of ExxonMobil, reassures a world that's alarmed by the warnings of climate warming. He says, as a species, we have spent our entire existence adapting, and so we will adapt to this. No, Rex, that's dumb. I mean, you may be smart enough to make $32 million a year, and so you're probably way smarter than I am, but even I know that that's not going to work. If your house is on fire, Rex, if your house is on fire, do you appoint a commission to study how you're going to adapt to living in the burnt-out, smoldering shell of a house? You do not. You put out the fire. And I think this is a particular issue on the coast. Sorry, folks. I have a student who's studying collaborative climate change efforts on the coast. And what she is telling me is that government agencies are still not willing to risk saying the word climate change. Words, climate change. However, they are talking about adaptation. They're talking about raising buildings, they're talking about armoring the coast, they're talking about raising highways. In many, many ways, they're talking about adaptation. So they are carrying on these political agendas of adapting to something that has no name and is not acknowledged in this world. That's weird. A rational person is going to stop the cause of something terrible rather than adapt to its effect. I mean, you treat the colon cancer, you don't decide to live without your guts. So I have this new drinking game. It's kind of like a drinking game. And if any of you are city officials, and if you have a group of people who's gathered to talk about your plans for your community, Anybody in that meeting, if the word adaptation comes up, everybody has to stand up and say, "Stop this madness." And then they can drink if they want to. That is optional. What I want to say is that any plan for adaptation has to really answer 3 questions, and I think these questions are big. The first one is, does that adaptation effort take urgency or resources away from the immediate and overriding moral necessity of stopping the fossil fuel-based destabilization of the world? If it can't, then it can't be justified. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is especially true when what's being prevented is irretrievable damage to the natural systems that support all life. And it really worries me that adaptation can become a form of acceptance of the harms. I think that every time a community decides it's going to focus on adaptation, the fossil fuel industry just chuckles. They win. And I also think that it can be a smokescreen that hides or minimizes the real consequences of global warming, and so it delays action. And it allows people to continue to live as they always have. And it allows the companies to continue to profit as they always have, even while the world is missing its last chance to stop runaway climate change. That really, really worries me. And the third thing that worries me is that I worry that the impulse behind adaptation plans is this notion that you can take care of your own time, your own family, and your own self in isolation from taking care of everybody else. So I think that adaptation is a kind of pulling in. And what I think is that the time has passed when we can protect one part of the world without protecting it all. And another way of saying that is that for better or worse, climate change makes selfishness impossible. See what I mean? That climate change is a signal of the end of selfishness. It's a signal that we are all in this together. And that no matter how you might protect or try to protect your home and your family, the way to do that is to protect everyone's home and everyone's family. And if they can't do that, then I don't think it's going to work. So the third view that I think stands in the way of our taking action is this one, that it's hopeless, that it's too late, that nothing can be done. And let's face it, our options are limited. And our cities and our homes and our transportation systems are disgracefully designed. And destructive ways of living are skillfully woven into all these tangles of profit and power around the world. And corporations are behaving like psychopaths, and we have run out of time. Even the most conscientious person is going to have a hard time making a difference. And so here's the problem with that. The problem is that we're caught in a bind, and it's a trap. On the one hand, we think, well, if you have blind hope, okay, everything is going to be fine, something will happen, there will be some sort of earth adjustment or something, and it's going to be okay, that's a kind of moral abdication, because if everything's going to be okay, you don't have to do anything. Yeah? On the other hand, if you have this blinding despair, that's a kind of moral abdication too, because if it's going to be bad no matter what you do, you don't have to do anything. So blind hope or blinding despair, you don't have to do anything. But that's a logical fallacy. It's the fallacy of false dichotomy, because between the hope, this blind hope, and the blinding despair is this very broad moral ground that we call integrity. And moral integrity is wholeness, like an integer. It's wholeness. It's acting in such a way that we achieve a matching between what we believe and what we do. Acting out of integrity is being the kind of person who walks the talk. A person with integrity lives gratefully because they believe that life is a gift. And a person with integrity acts reverently because they believe the world is sacred. They live simply because we don't believe in taking more than our fair share. And we act lovingly towards the world because we love it. You see the point I'm making? It doesn't matter if we succeed or fail. What matters is that we live a life that we believe in. And this is what I urge in a time, and this is what saves people in difficult times, is this notion that I may not control the consequences, but I can control my decisions. And I think what it's going to mean is a fierce and a tireless, and I would admit perhaps tragic, defense of the world against the people who live right here. So what are we going to do? 3 things. They all start with C. So if you're taking notes, this is easy. Conscientious objection, creative disruption, and courageous, relentless citizenship. Okay, here's what I mean. Conscientious objection. Are you old enough to remember? Oh dear, here comes that word. You say it. What did soldiers say during the what did people say during the Vietnam War? Okay, I didn't say that. Tell the newspaper I didn't say that. They did. And I guess the question is, can we say the same thing to an unjust and far more disastrous economic system? Can we say, no, I won't be part of it? I will refuse to let big oil make me a foot soldier in the war against the world. And here's what I mean. Every decision that we make, how we travel, what we drive, what we eat, what we invest in, how many children we have, what kinds of things we buy for them, every decision we make embodies a moral value. Our decisions speak for us. Yes, I believe in this. No, I do not believe in that, and I will not participate. And this requires, and it offers us the chance for the radical imagination of new ways to live on earth that are consistent with what we believe in, ways that are joyous and fair. And don't think for a minute that your decisions, your personal decisions like this don't matter. Because study after study shows that the single most powerful way to influence people to change is when a person they respect and like changes. So that your change is an inspiration for sure to other people. And I want to say that this is true of people, this opportunity to reimagine how things go, this opportunity to match your beliefs, but it's also an opportunity for towns. That just as people make decisions that define them, towns make decisions that define them. And here's a chance for Yachats to be the kind of town that walks its talk. Here's the town for Yachats to declare itself a zero-carbon town, the first one on the coast. Here's a way for Yachats as a town to come together to act in ways that are consistent with its deepest values. So that's the first thing I think we have to consider, and that is the conscientious objection. The second thing is creative disruption. You people live by a river, so you know how rivers work, right? If you can stand by the river and you can say, man, look at that current. That river is really rumbling. But if you watch a river, you'll notice that where there's a stone in the river, it changes everything. That the current goes through and around, goes up to and then around the stone and curls in behind and reverses the course of the river. Am I right? So you don't have to stop a river. What you have to do is drop stones in it. This is what I mean by creative disruption. Can you block the force of the river? The river, in this case, the analogy, of course, is to this onrushing economy, ruinously growing economy. Can you stop the river by, or slow it, or change it, by simply dropping in a little bit of disruption here and a little bit of disruption there? It doesn't have to, you don't have to dam the whole river. That takes too much carbon. But you can do small things. And the biggest thing, I think, is telling the truth. I think we're all called to witness, to tell the truth about the moral consequence of an oil-fueled future. These are usually symbolic, these are usually artistic, these are usually fun, these are usually creative, these are usually community building, and they're often even funny. If you believe that coal dust is going to make people sick, then send the choir to sing a requiem at the railroad crossing. If Obama broke his promises about climate change, then surround the White House with placards reminding him what he said. This is the spirit behind the kind of actions that are happening. This is the hearse that follows the fracking trucks. This is the roadside funeral bouquets at the turnoff to the logging site. And as it must in times when there's a massive moral failure of government, and only in times when there's a massive moral failure of government, some of this creative destruction is going to be direct action and civil disobedience, as we have already seen. I don't want to say it's easy, but I want to say it's possible. And here's what's really interesting. The great complex systems scientists have got the future all mapped out. You know, they plugged in carbon, they plugged in the atmospheric change, they plugged in heat, they plugged in all this chemistry, and they ran the models, and they can pretty much figure out what's going to happen next. It's not pretty. The one data point that is not in those models is the response of human beings to the crisis. If you plug in one kind of data point, one sort of creative resistance on the part of the people, it changes the whole way the model unfolds. So it really gives me kind of hope, it gives me a happiness to know that even as they're cranking out doom, they are ignorant of one thing, and that is they're not counting on the resilience and the creative imagination and the moral integrity of the people. And I think that we're seeing already this kind of data point. We are all data points in that calculation. Thirdly, then I said courageous and relentless citizenship. This is democracy. Yeah, this is a democracy. Make your voices heard. Let crying out in all its forms be the first thing you do in the morning and the last thing you do before bed. Put Governor Kitzhaber on your speed dial. Call him up. Give him courage. What are we going to tell him? What do we have to do? Okay, you are about to hear the only scientifically based comment that I have made so far tonight. This one comes from economists who have tried to figure out how we're going to get ourselves out of this mess. Two things, that's all, two things. Number one, stop, block, prevent, in any way, stop all investments that expand the fossil fuel industry infrastructure. And that means no coal port expansion, no coal trains, no liquid natural gas deports, no pipelines, no new roads to carry the equipment, no fracking pads, no more infrastructure for fossil fuels. That's a terrible investment now. You won't be able to do it. You put your money in that, you're losing it. And number two, the immediate implementation of policies that restrict carbon pollution by price or regulation. We know what we have to do. We just have to get busy doing it. And so the question of the hour is, what do you love too much to lose? I've named three things: justice, children, and this beautiful earth. What do you love too much to lose? In what ways is it threatened by climate change? And how are you going to change that river? So let me simply conclude with a quotation from Clarissa Estes. She says, "Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. Yes, for years we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. I recognize a seaworthy vessel when I see one. There have never been more able vessels in the water than there are right now across the world. And they are fully provisioned and able to signal one another as never before in the history of humankind. There will always be times when you feel discouraged. I, too, have felt despair many times in my life, but I do not keep a chair for it. I will not entertain it. It is not allowed to eat from my plate. I hope you will write this on your wall. When a great ship is in harbor and moored, it is safe. There can be no doubt. But that is not what great ships are built for. Together, we're a great ship, and we are under sail." I would be happy to take questions, as long as they're not mean. Okay.
Can you speak a little bit more concretely about what it would mean for us in practical terms to be a zero carbon community?
I understand the mayor's in the house. The question is, what would it take for us to be a carbon neutral community? That's a really good question. I would suggest that the mayor appoint a committee to figure that out exactly. And I suggest that the mayor appoints you to head that committee. Do you know what I understand? Well, it's going to take two approaches, isn't it? One will be to reduce your need for fossil fuels, and the other will be to replace your source of fossil fuels, right? And I don't know what your options are in either of those ways, but I bet there are as many ideas as there are people in this room. Reduction is always the low-hanging fruit, isn't it? Conservation is the low-hanging fruit. How can you, Juneau, an avalanche, this won't happen to you guys, but an avalanche came and took out their major power line from their plant. And so immediately the price of the fossil fuels in Anchorage just, big right, Juneau, skyrocketed. Frank, can you remember what that was? I can't remember. Anyway, just a second, but what Frank does remember is going into a bar and having it lit by candlelight and having more fun than he's ever had because people just immediately reduce their use of fossil fuels to 20%. It can be done, and candlelight is nice. But I'm joking there. I really do think that this is something that should be seriously considered and something that you really could do some good thinking about. Sir, you're standing.
Yeah, I don't know if Joanna could tell us here or not tonight, but to get people motivated locally, I think she could tell us about the logging that's going to take place in the area that people here are interested in protecting. And I was wondering if we could get something formed for a protest against that. And I'd like to hear more from her if she is here.
Is she here?
She's home.
But
Okay, sir, she's not apparently here, but you are, and so when we're done with the questions about this topic, it would be really quite wonderful for you to stand and tell us about that.
because they're going to start doing some logging this winter, is what she said.
Okay.
So it's real soon. It's going to happen soon.
It's really important for the community to know about that, so let's get to that.
Okay.
Don't let me forget. Please.
Recently, I've read that between 18 and 49% of carbon emissions are actually a result of the meat and dairy industry. Can you address that at all?
Yeah, it's methane, huh?
Well, and other things in the production and water use, and I mean, it's unsustainable. The amount of meat that is eaten in this country is totally unsustainable. And
Yeah, so a really quick way to reduce your carbon footprint is to stop eating meat. I think that's exactly right. Somebody else, shout them out. What are some of the other ways you yourself can reduce your carbon footprint?
carpool,
Carpool?
not breathe.
Breathing is fine, it's exhaling.
breathe.
It's exhaling.
Grow your own garden.
Grow your own garden, and in every respect, eat local food to the extent that you can. Absolutely. Plant trees.
Nuclear energy.
I heard nuclear energy. Did you hear nuclear energy? James Hansen thinks it's an answer. I do not. I beg your pardon?
When they can do fusion, maybe, then you can set aside the pieces that you don't want to have out in the world.
You two should talk.
I'm a scientist.
Yeah. Please.
I think people need to remember too that it's easy to feel powerless, but every single dime and dollar you spend should be spent consciously, and that's where your power is, and that's where even the little person who doesn't have any money can make a difference.
Every dime, every dollar, and every moment. You have this one wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver said. How are you going to live it? What are you going to live it for? In whose service are you going to spend your life? I think that's important questions to ask.
And if
Yeah.
we quit giving our dollars to the corporations that are making plastic and endless plastic gizmos that we think we can't live without, if we quit giving them our money, what's going to happen? They'll
That's
crumble.
good. And somebody told me, you'll have to tell me, somebody told me that Yachats had the highest median income of any community on the coast. Is that true? It's true. Okay, now we need to talk about investments. Now we need to talk about where you're putting your money. And are you investing in the fossil fuel industry or are you not, sir?
That's not true, and it's important to know why not.
Okay,
Yachats has the highest possession of wealth. The median income in this county is less than two or three of the other towns tends to be on the bottom side in this county of income of the cities in this county.
An important distinction and one that I should not have glossed over. Thank you. Thank you for the correction. Yes, please.
I think cutting down on our consumption or eliminating our consumption of, how do I want to say this, gratuitous corn products.
Gratuitous corn products.
Yeah, like ethanol and high fructose corn syrup and what else? Because it takes so much water, it depletes the land, and it just doesn't help in any way. It's just their way of finding more uses for their products.
So this is really, really interesting what you say, because it signals a sea change. It signals a different way of thinking. It signals a kind of global thinking where you do try to connect the dots, where you do try to think about how one decision has an effect here and there, or stems from this and that. And it's a kind of thoughtfulness that I think is really going to serve us very, very well. And corn syrup is a really good example of it, but there are so many others. And it's a matter of really conscientious. Maybe what we need to do is not decide that we will all tonight pledge our lives to recycling, but to say we will all pledge our lives to really thinking carefully about the decisions that we make, in a broader sense. Yes, sir. Oh, does everybody know, stand up please, does everybody know this man?
Yeah.
I only today met him, but I've been getting his emails all along. This is Occupy Yachats, which is hilarious to me. I think that's great. Yes, sir, what were you going to say?
I didn't do it.
Oh, yes, you did your own.
Please.
I've been here since 2000, my wife Vicki and I. And what I hear from people who live here and from tourists again and again and again is the reason they love Yachats is because it is a unique and beautiful and quirky place. It is not like every place else. I have been researching, not very successfully, an anti-franchise ordinance for Yachats in order to keep out McDonald's, Starbucks, Motel 6, and on and on and on. To keep our money local, to keep local businesses open. And one of the things we could do to strike a little blow at corporations is to do something like that. And anyone, especially someone good at research who would be willing to help, would you please let me know, and let's get going on this.
It's a good positive note. We have been going for an hour, and I know that you're tired, and I certainly thank you so much for coming. The gentleman here, you see, would you raise your hand again, the one who talks about logging? Will you see him to hear more about this logging plan and the actions that might be taken to exert your community will on that plan? And then let me just say that I think you guys are wonderful, and thank you so very much for coming.